Hi, I'm Josh, and welcome back to my channel. I am somebody who stays way far away from internet drama and that sort of thing. However, in a recent turn of events in the tiny little bubble of BookTube, an author named Erikson, author of the Malazan or Marzipan or however you pronounce it, this author managed to unintentionally stir up a whole big controversy, and it's a whole thing. And the thing is, though, it falls right within my whole theming of the art and artist series that I had only done one video on so far. So while I thought that I was finished talking about reviewers with part 1 of this series, I'm actually in part 2. I'm going to continue to talk about reviewers and their relationships with creators and artists. So just a quick summary of the whole BookTube kerfuffle. Essentially, a BookTuber had made a video about Erikson's Malazan series, which is a 10-book high fantasy series. And in the comments below the video, 2 viewers started to debate one particular aspect of this book series. And then the actual author, Erikson, came along and decided to comment on the debate that was happening. And as well, the author went to his own Facebook page and wrote a whole essay about the topic that was being discussed as well. So that, in a nutshell, was what happened. And as a result, some booktubers, book reviewers, created a huge stink over the fact that an artist would dare to come into their reviewer spaces and have things to say about their book or things that are being discussed around it. This very small minority of reviewers, from what I've seen, argues that an author should not have anything to say about a review of their work, that the author inserting themselves into that conversation creates power dynamics that are problematic for the reviewer, in that they might feel pressured in the future to maybe not say anything negative about that author's work for fear of hearing from that author, as well as perhaps being bullied by that author's fan base, because in a lot of instances, the author's fan base is much larger than the YouTuber or booktuber's fan base. And so that's where the, I guess, sense of a power dynamic comes into play there. I think that's the general gist of the issues that these few reviewers were having. Now, the perspectives that I bring to the conversation here are, number one, I've never read any of Erikson's books. I have no intention of reading the Malazan series because it is apparently a very deep, complex, gritty, high fantasy world where each of these 10 books in the series are a really large book, so it's a huge world and a huge series, and it doesn't seem like something that I would have the energy to really dive into and get through. So just for that reason alone, I'm not particularly interested in Malazan. As a result, I don't really have a dog in the fight per se. The other perspective I bring is that of a guy in his mid-40s. So many of these booktubers, like a lot of YouTubers, are in their 20s, sometimes even late teens, and they bring a different perspective than somebody like me. Now, as a middle-aged guy, I grew up with 3 ways to communicate with other humans. Number 1, I could sit with them and have a face-to-face conversation. Number 2, I could dial them up on my rotary phone and have a conversation on the phone. Or 3, I could sit down and write out a letter, or if I lived in a really posh household, type it up on a typewriter and post it in the mail. And of those 3 ways to communicate, only one of them, writing the letter, was not a real-time conversation. Now, unfortunately, I think my kids are growing up in a world now where conversation is becoming a bit of a lost art. So much of communication now does not happen in real time, and if it is, it's via text messages where it's not exactly real time, because you can take as much time as you want to type up a comment or reply to a comment. So we live in a world that feels very strange to me in its lack of conversations. And I think this is going to be the key point that I want to discuss when it comes to this relationship between reviewers and creators, which is the fact that I believe that conversation is a great thing. I love the fact that Steven Erikson was known for involving himself in social media, in people who had things to say about his work, that he would take the time out to join the conversation, to be a part of his fan base and not just silently watch from afar, but to actually express himself and be part of the conversation around social media and discussions of his books and that sort of thing. I think that is really cool that he took the time to do that. Unfortunately, he's decided to now step away from YouTube and no longer do that due to the response he's received from a few vocal people. But I'm also coming into this as somebody who does discuss other people's works. I don't like to call myself a reviewer. I don't like to think that I review creative efforts. I feel like I'm just somebody who just enjoys chatting about whatever happens to come up in my brain as I am experiencing the books or games or music or whatever it is that I happen to be enjoying. In the process, I tend to be fairly balanced, I think, about what I say about things in terms of bringing up positive things that pop into my head or negative things as well. I know that when I recently made a couple of videos about the board game The Shores of Tripoli, I was well aware that the game author, game designer I should say, was going to be watching those videos and maybe commenting on them, maybe not. Speaking of board games, I've been a part of the board gaming little hobby bubble for many, many years, and reviews used to be all written, and sometimes the game designers would come in and comment in written reviews, and again, I didn't see that as being particularly problematic. There certainly were some designers who would kind of make a bit of a fool of themselves by coming in with a really whiny tone in response to maybe a more negative review. That's never a particularly good look. But yeah, so when I'm talking about somebody's game with the idea that the designer might be watching, or very likely will be watching, it certainly makes me extremely aware of any negative things I have to say. I did have a couple of, I guess, minor complaints with The Shores of Tripoli, and when I was talking about those, it was in the back of my mind that the designer was going to be watching and wouldn't be necessarily happy to hear about negative things. I don't think it would be any different if the designer came in to then talk about it. I mean, I don't know if that necessarily puts more pressure on me as somebody who's discussing their creative work. But nowadays we're living in kind of a weirder world where a lot of conversation feels like two people just shouting into the cosmos or shouting at one another and not necessarily conversing with each other. We see this in our increasingly polarized political society, where to have a productive conversation about a political matter is something that it seems so foreign at this point, because most people just want to find out what their team thinks about a particular issue, and then that's what they're going to shout at the other side, instead of maybe examining the issue in itself and discussing pros and cons and coming to mutual agreements. That's never going to happen. We live in a world where people can put their opinions out there regardless of what those opinions might be, which is a little bit of a different situation than if you're sitting one-on-one with somebody having a conversation with them. Then you might be a little bit more conscious of the other person you're talking to if you're spouting off certain opinions about things. In that manner, all of this stuff ties into other issues like free speech or cancel culture, in that the modern idea of what people think of as free speech is, I want the freedom to shout anything out into the world, no matter how hateful or awful, without any consequences or retaliation, I suppose. When, as I keep saying, people don't understand there's no such thing as free speech. Speech always has consequences. And if it doesn't, that's where something is seriously wrong. Cancel culture too. If somebody hears something from a creator that they don't like, they might immediately want to just shut them down, put them in a box, never hear from them again, which might be appropriate in some cases of extremely hateful, harmful type of speech, or worse yet, actions, such as I've heard of authors going to conventions where they are celebrities and using that power dynamic to sexually assault young fans, for instance. In that case, it's like, we don't need to support this person. We don't need to give them a voice. This is not appropriate, no matter how you want to talk about it. But a lot of the time, instead of they say something, it's not okay, we shut them up, we have a conversation. It comes back again to this old-fashioned idea of conversations. We say, that maybe wasn't an appropriate thing to say, and here's why. And maybe then the creator can have a chance to say, oh, I'm sorry, you're right, that maybe wasn't the best thing, here's how I will change. Or they might dig their heels in and come at it even harder, then at which point you can say, okay, I don't need to hear anything from you or support you anymore. And that's cool. But without the conversation, all we do is we make factions and further divide people who are just busy yelling at each other instead of listening to each other. And that's how it all circles back to this situation for me, where a reviewer is going to put something out there about the author and their work without wanting any consequences for that or any explanation from the person who created that work or who wrote that book. It's such a weird thought. What if the reviewer has truly misunderstood something and accidentally misrepresented it, and the author wants to explain, no, here's what you missed, here's maybe the proper perspective on what I've created. Not that there's proper perspective is maybe the best word, because everybody is going to have their own feelings and perspectives that arise from involving themselves with a created thing. But conversations can only deepen understanding, and I just don't like this idea that we cannot have conversations, that one person should just be able to shout whatever they want, the other person should be able to shout whatever they want, and nothing productive gets done. That bothers me a lot about the world I live in nowadays. But let me tell you where the true problem does lie, and that is with fan bases. So yeah, the author can come in and maybe the reviewer would find it intimidating to have the author there commenting on their review, and that's kind of understandable and fair. But the author on their own can't necessarily do much harm. It's when either they themselves rile up their fan base, or the fan base themselves decides to become riled up on behalf of the author, which really seems to have happened with this whole Steven Erikson situation. The whole Steven Erikson fan base is really shouting down anybody that has anything to say about the way Steven Erikson acted. As you've seen, I've kind of defended Steven Erikson's involvement and his actions in this particular situation, but what is pretty atrocious is the way his fan base have acted towards people who disagree. That's where real bullying can happen, and again, that's where the whole factionalization of things occurs. I know that when I chat about board games or books on my channel, if I dare to say anything negative, which again I do if it happens to be something that I want to chat about, I will get thumbs down on the video by people who are fans of that game or that book or that particular work. Worse yet are the people where if I talk glowingly about a game or a book that I really love, the people who dislike that thing will also thumb down or say negative things because they like something better that they would like to push up ahead of whatever it is you're talking about, because it's some kind of competition to them or something. I don't know. So I know that as somebody who discusses creative efforts, that I'm going to be on the receiving end of both negative responses from the hyper fans to the haters. It's like you're never gonna really please anybody, it seems, as somebody who is on YouTube. Thankfully, there are some of you who do take the time to leave comments that are worthy of discussion below my videos. Even when you sometimes disagree with me, you can state it and we can chat about it and we can have that conversation, which is pretty cool. So a big thank you to you who are still of that mindset where conversations are a helpful thing. But yeah, that whole thing about the fan base, it's pretty hard to do anything about that, unfortunately. The best that I can do with my own YouTube channel is delete people who are being purposely harmful, hateful, and I can curate the kind of space that I create in my tiny little piece of YouTube here. And I have no problem getting rid of people who want to just create trouble, because it's a big internet and they can always find a space where they can shout their hatred and be listened to. And it doesn't have to happen in my happy little space. I don't know if that makes any sense. Tell me in the comments below. Have a conversation with me. Tell me what you think, either about the specifics of this BookTube drama or about the general idea of creators interacting with the reviewers of their work. I'm really interested in hearing more about it. I know I've spent time watching videos and listening to both sides of this particular debate, so it's been interesting to me, and I'd love to continue the conversation with you. And meanwhile, I want to send a huge, massive thank you to my Patreon supporters, especially to my bigger tier supporters, Joanna and Paul. Your support really does mean the world to me. I have so far 2 Patreon exclusive videos that are up there and more to come. So if you want to just get involved at $2 a month even, there is extra content there for you if you want to do so. Hey, be kind to each other and keep the conversations going. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video. That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers. And that are often, I'm also coming, I know that when I recently discussed the board game, I know that when I recently discussed the board game The Shores of Tripoli, I know that when I recently made a couple of videos about The Shores of Tripoli, the board reviews used to be all on for each, as somebody who